and we have this afternoon with us Stephani Jones. Stephani is the Gerald Lesser Professor in Early Childhood Development. So we actually have another Sesame Street connection here, not because she was advising Sesame Street 50 years ago, clearly, but her chair is named after one of the main advisors of the development of Sesame Street. So that was an unintended additional connection to our Sesame Street week. So Stephani conducts developmental research, curriculum design research, impact evaluation research, and policy-driven research on socio-emotional development, and how can we alter pathways to improve socio-emotional learning in children, but also the classroom practices and the environments that support such socio-emotional learning. With Noni Lesor, she also leads what do you call the science initiative? An institute?
It's an initiative.
An initiative.
The Science Early Education Initiative.
There you go. It's a large-scale effort to develop professional learning and to prepare leaders, a pipeline of leaders to drive a high-quality education, early childhood education. So Stephani has received numerous awards and is part of numerous committees and group experts, group panels to inform socio-emotional development and anti-poverty policies. And so truly she, in one person, sort of condenses the goals that we have for our ProLeer network. So Stephani, our ProLeer network is, we are a group of researchers, policymakers, educators, NGO leaders that get together for 2 days here with the highest possible level of enthusiasm, I would say, to learn everything we can about the latest research and from each other to bring it immediately home to inform their practices. So, you know, we are thrilled to have you here. We know how hectic your week is, and we are looking forward to learning from you, and they will all take the lessons immediately to inform your work. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. So, I hope you don't fall asleep. That's the first thing I'll say, because it is that time of day. It's 4 o'clock. I feel like taking a nap. So if you feel like you would like to take a nap, you can just stand up and walk around and do some deep breathing, which is something that we do in SEL practice to calm ourselves down or to amp ourselves up. So I won't be offended if you feel that you need to get up and walk around a little bit, because it is the late afternoon. I know you know this, but it is, and it's often the time that we take naps. At least we would like to take naps. So I'm going to talk about social emotional learning, and I'm going to tell you a whole lot of things about it. I often organize these kinds of presentations to cover a big area of research, to talk as much about practice. It is absolutely on, or not. Now it's on. It seemed like it turned off on its own, though. Okay, we'll find out. We'll do an experiment. Okay. So, as I was saying, I often organize these talks to cover research. So, a lot of research about a particular topic, social and emotional learning in this case, to talk as much about practice and really try and connect the two. And so that's how I've organized our time together. I said 60-ish minutes. We'll have plenty of time for lots of questions and interaction. There's lots of stuff to talk about, and I'd love to hear from you. So 60-ish minutes. I'm going to talk about my lab, which is called the EASL Lab, and try and give you a sense of the different kinds of things that we do. I'll talk about the science of social emotional learning. I'll talk about the practice, as we know it, of social emotional learning today. And then I thought I would talk about two things that I really love to talk about, which is new stuff for the field, innovations that we think will make a difference in practice, and innovations that we think will more tightly connect research and practice and policy. So I'll end there. If I go way over time, which I will not do, although who knows. I'll just stop and then we'll have questions. And I'm happy to make these slides available to anybody who would like them at any time. Okay, so those are the two innovations, we'll get to those. So the backdrop is really the EASL lab, and in this lab, we call it EASL. It stands for Ecological Approaches to Social Emotional Learning. And the reason we put ecological in there is that a lot of work in social emotional learning is focused on the child and the child only. And our view, and the view of much of the research community, is that the child's skills and competencies are situated in a context and with a whole landscape of experience behind it. And so we want to make sure every time we talk about social emotional learning, we're always thinking about experiences and context. So that's why we call it ecological. Nobody ever wants to say that, so they just say EASL lab. So that's what we do. We have three big categories of work. We do research and evaluation. So I'm a developmental psychologist by training. I like to do big, long-term studies of children in schools or children in families over many, many years. So we do longitudinal studies of human development. Most of them are focused on this domain, social and emotional and behavioral development. We do evaluations of strategies, practices, and programs in the field. So we do randomized trials of different things. We do other kinds of trials of things. So that's kind of just more traditional research and evaluation. In the middle, we have intervention and practice development and implementation, and this is a newer part of our work, maybe mostly over the last 9 to 10 years. Doesn't sound new, but new in a relative sense. And we design programs, and we design strategies and practices that are designed for schools, for classrooms, for home and family. And we work with educators, practitioners of different types, families, to try things out, give us feedback, to revise them, and then try them again. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that. And then finally, we do work that we call, kind of in a grandiose way, building the field. And I'm going to show you a little bit of this, but this is the part of our work where we try and communicate to the field, about the field, in a very broad and general way. So we write reports about what works. We write a great deal about the language and the terminology of the social emotional learning field and how complicated that is and perhaps dangerous. I'll get into that. And we design tools that help the field navigate its own challenges. So those are the three major things. Our focus, our sort of orienting framework is really what I would call prevention science, which fundamentally is about linking what we know to what we do. And everything we do in the lab, and I would say much of what the faculty do at the Harvard Graduate School of Education really sits inside this cycle and often touches many components of it. So prevention science, as I said, is about linking what we know to what we do, and it's really about tightly connecting research and evidence to how we design and structure strategies and practices. And then, again, to how we design assessment and evaluation, which then, when we learn something, informs the top of the cycle again. And our view is that ensuring that these links between these parts of the cycle are very tight and closely connected is essential to being effective in the field, to being effective in research, being effective in practice. And one thing I'll just foreshadow for a little bit later, it'll come up the whole way through as you'll see, is that the terminology of social emotional learning is not tight. It's not connected, it's not precise, it's kind of all over the place. And it has made it difficult for the field to tell a coherent and consistent story about what we know and what we do. And so what we're trying to do is push the field to get a little bit more tightly connected in this cycle and precise in the work. I don't know if we are successful. You'll tell me when you see what I'm going to show you. You can tell me if it's successful. So that's kind of the big backdrop of the work in our lab. We have a website. I don't know what the name is, but it has easel in it, and you can look it up. And we have lots of stuff on there. So now to what we know. This is 25 years, maybe 30 years of science of different types in this broad field, distilled into just a few slides. So forgive me for squinching it into this very, probably overly simplistic pile. But it'll give you a sense of the parameters of what we know. So to start, I always start with trying to define what social emotional learning is. And many people know and have an idea of what it is, but the way they think about it likely differs from one person to the next or one setting to the next. And so I often start by just trying to evoke the classroom and the child in the classroom. So you could put yourself inside this picture, and if you work with young people older than these young children, you could imagine yourself in a classroom where they are. Or if you work with young children, you can imagine yourself in a classroom where they are. If you work with families, you can imagine yourself in a family with an adult and a child or a couple of children reading a book. And just cast your head into the head of that child, the experience of that child or that adolescent or that teacher or that parent. And you think about what the child really needs to do to be able to interact with the adult reading that story aloud. There are a few things they have to do. Just imagine put yourself in that moment and think, what do you have to do to be able to do that task successfully? You need to be able to focus your thinking, right? Orient your attention and your brain to what the adult is saying or to the words and the pictures in that book. So your thinking has to be organized and focused. You need to be able to manage your behavior. So that's a tight space. And if you know young children or adolescents, you put them close together, and this kind of stuff starts to happen, right? And that leads to something else. So you need to be able to not do that, even though you really want to. It's uncomfortable. They're too close. And you want to poke them, push them away. You need to be able to manage your behavior, and that can take many different forms. Build and have positive relationships. You need to be able to have a sense of trust and communication with that adult and with the other children around you in order to access the information they're sharing with you. So there isn't a kind of a roadblock between you and the adult who is sharing information. You trust that what they're saying is something you can believe, and you're safe in that environment to learn it. And then finally, understand and deal with feelings. You could imagine, especially with young children, but adolescents absolutely also, that the topic of that book might raise different kinds of emotions. Ideally, it would, because that's what's interesting to the children in the room. But those feelings have to be managed in the moment. It might be frustration, it might be a feeling of like surprise or anger, or just overwhelming excitement. You have to be able to recognize that and deal with it in the moment. So all of those things are swirling about and are necessary to be successful at the learning task that's happening in this picture or any other learning task you can imagine. So that feels, to me, like a pretty simple explanation of what social and emotional learning is. In the field, it's not that simple. So this is a snapshot of headlines from the last, 10 years maybe fewer years, but there's just a million of them. If you Google social and emotional learning, you'll just get lots of different stuff. And where we started, simple, imagining the child in the classroom, what we actually have in the world is a lot of disciplines, perspectives, viewpoints, words and names that characterize this field. And there's just a subset that finds its way into the news. And there are things like character traits, grit, self-control, so on, emotional intelligence, a psychological approach to educating kids, social and emotional learning is there, all kinds of things. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. It's probably a good thing, because there are lots of disciplines that are contributing to the knowledge base, to how we understand this field, and capturing its pretty wide boundaries. The part that gets complicated is that it's very difficult to know who's talking about the same thing when. So when you say to me, character traits, I think one thing, but maybe you're thinking something else, and we're probably both right. So we have to figure out how to communicate more precisely in this field. So in the lab, in our way, we do lib reviews and we try and organize things into compendia and the kinds of things that most people in the world don't want to do. And we do it because we like to think about how to get precise about the terminology. So over time, we've done a number of lit reviews trying to capture the words that are used in the scientific community and the practice community that really characterize this field. And this is how we put it together. So, social emotional learning includes skills and competencies in 3 major areas. There's a cognitive area, a social area, and an emotional area. There's not really much of a surprise there. Most people leave out the cognitive domain until relatively recently, but when you say social and emotional learning, it's often not pulled up into someone's head. And when we define these in the cognitive domain, we generally find, I can't read that screen, maybe I could read this one, things like managing and shifting attention, I talked about attention already, controlling impulses, planning, goal setting, critical thinking, sometimes people put things like creativity in there. In the emotion domain, we have things like emotion, knowledge, and expression, emotion and behavioral regulation, empathy, all the kind of emotional competencies. In the social, am I going to that? Okay, it's not working. It's because it keeps turning off. I didn't turn it off, I swear. Okay, I'll just keep turning it on every once in a while. Okay. Yeah, if you raise your hand as soon as it goes off, I'll turn it on here. The social domain includes things like understanding social cues, being able to read and interpret the social environment without language to support you necessarily. Social perspective taking, so jumping into the shoes of another and understanding their viewpoint on a situation. Pro-social behavior, conflict resolution, social problem solving. These are the terms and the skills and competencies that are defined in the literature, and I would say this is a good view of what comprises social emotional skills and competencies. Of course, there are lots of overlaps between them. You could imagine how some of these terms go into other categories. That's okay, because that's just the real world. There's a whole other set as well. And this is where things get complicated, confusing, and a little ideological for some. So the other set that you find in the literature, if you look broadly across disciplines, are what a colleague of mine calls the belief ecology. And these are attitudes, ways of thinking, habits of mind, and they generally fall into 3 categories. One is beliefs and knowledge about oneself and one's identity, character and values, and then what we just generally call personality. So there's a lot of literature out there about personality characteristics and how they are related to future outcomes, and they are called often social and emotional skills. I don't think they're the same thing, but they're clearly under the big umbrella, and it's important to understand exactly what they are and distinguish them from each other. So what we find in these 3 categories are things like self-efficacy, growth, mindset, the whole world of mindsets, agency, self-esteem, self-knowledge. Sometimes you hear words like purpose. That's that first category. The second category are ethical, performance, intellectual, and civic values. So values that structure society, that guide civic life. And then personality characteristics, I won't say traits, but characteristics like optimism, gratitude, openness, enthusiasm. We increasingly hear things like zest, which I don't know what that is, but I'm trying to be zesty up here, keep you awake at 4 o'clock. So how do these big parts go together? Sometimes we talk about it in this way. The skills and competencies are the things that you know how to do. And then the belief ecology is kind of like a filter. It guides whether or not you use those skills and competencies when you need to use them. So it's almost like it sits in between having the skill or competency and then using it in a particular situation. So that's how I would define social and emotional learning. It is not the same as how others define it. It's not the same as how it's on. It looks like it's on. How the Castle organization defines it. It's not the same as how Character Lab defines it. It's not the same as how the Center for Emotional Intelligence defines it. But it captures the boundaries of what all of those entities talk about. So there was recently a national commission on social, emotional, and academic development in the US. It ran for 2.5 years, or maybe 3 years, and it was sponsored by a bunch of foundations and coordinated by the Aspen Institute. And that commission, national commission, convened scientists and educators and wrote a whole bunch of very useful reports that sit for free on their website. And in doing all of that work, generated a framework that I think is actually quite useful. I think it's useful because it's a lot like my way of thinking about it. So I was on the commission and I contributed to writing it. So there's a little bit of, like, I wrote my own thing in there, but I still think it's right. So, and this is their framework, and I think that this framework over time will begin to capture the attention of those working in the field and will be used more than others are currently used, because it really is inclusive. It has in the middle those cognitive, emotional, and social skills and competencies. It describes how those intersect with rigorous academic content and all kinds of learning experiences, and then it situates those in a ring that is represented by character and values on one side, and attitudes, beliefs, and mindsets on the other, and then the outer ring is sort of the situation. All of this happening in the context of interactions and experiences in the world. And I find it a useful way to organize some of this stuff that can then drive how we design and do our work. So that's the broad definition. Of course, as a developmentalist, I think about how things grow and change over time. And in our group, we've tried to put some developmental framing on this, which is, as you know, important when you are selecting a measure of social emotional skills for kindergartners versus 5th graders, or designing a strategy that is important and helpful for 3-year-olds versus 6-year-olds versus 10-year-olds. Because what's happening for kids of those different ages is obviously different. There are stage salient developmental tasks. And our view of how some of these unfold over at least the first 10 years is what I'm going to show you next. I don't know if it's right. We haven't tested this particular model. There isn't a description of this in the literature, but it is based on the kinds of skills and competencies that pop up in age-specific studies. And so the way we describe it is that in a first stage, or a first phase, which is really the sort of 3 to 6-year-old period, the entry into often more formal learning environments, is characterized by a big expansion in that prefrontal cortex where a lot of those core cognitive skills find themselves. So a big expansion in what some describe as executive functions, but also self-regulation. And then we see cognitive flexibility expand, self-control, attention control, working memory. We also see some basic emotion skills grow during that time. Children are working on emotion and behavior management. If anybody knows 3-year-olds, know that they are working hard to manage their emotions and behavior. And kids are learning about basic emotions and like where and how to express them in ways that make sense, given the context. In the social domain, basic social engagement. So not sophisticated problem solving, just basic social engagement. The reason that I make that point often is when you look at social and emotional learning curricula, what you often see is an expectation that young children are working on social problem solving when they are 4 and 5. And I would say, no, they can't do that. What they're doing is just experiencing the social world. They're learning how to read the social environment, which is what they should be working on. The next phase, operates kind of like building blocks, and this you can imagine is like roughly 6 or 7 into 8 or 9, maybe 3rd grade or so. And here you just see more sophisticated versions of each of these skills. So in the cognitive column, we have planning, organizing, setting goals. In the emotion column, more complex things like empathy and perspective taking. And in the social domain, really understanding and making judgments about social cues. It's really, really, really hard to take the perspective of another, to take your brain and put it inside the brain of another person if you don't have some level of cognitive flexibility, right? You need to be able to shift your thinking before you can take another's perspective. To really have empathy, you need an emotional repertoire, right? What am I feeling right now? What might you be feeling? And how am I connecting those two things? That's what empathy is. And then understanding social cues demands social experience, just a requirement. So as we move up the line toward the entry into middle school, into early adolescence, we then begin to see more sophisticated forms of prosocial behavior, cooperation, conflict resolution, which then demand all those component skills. The reason we find this is useful is because when we design strategies, we think about where are we going to pinpoint or developmentally locate what we're doing so that we can be efficient and, in a sense, super redundant. We want to be efficient, but we want to do things a lot. And so it really can't be too many things. We're not going to build all the skills at once, but we can really focus. The other reason a map like this is useful is when you're thinking about a child who's really struggling, maybe a 10 or 11-year-old who's really struggling in an area like social problem solving, really struggling with understanding why someone did what they did, why did they bump you when you were in the line, and jumping to conclusions about their behavior. It's useful to think, what are the downstream, more sort of simple skills that we could work on in order to build up that more complex skill for that particular child. So a map like this is helpful in thinking about those things. I don't do much work with those other 3 circles. Like I don't do work in mindset and personality, so I don't really have a sense of how they progress developmentally. There is an emerging literature that lines up some of those skills against a kind of rough developmental picture, and I'm happy to point you to what I know or have seen. So that's the developmental view. Now to the evidence about all those things. So we have a number of types of evidence at our disposal. We have what I would say are long-term correlational studies. There's probably a handful of them, really just a very few, where children and families have been followed for 20 to 30 years. And there is enough data across time in this domain to say something about relationships between how kids do when they're 6 or 5 and how they do when they're 20 or 30. And people describe these studies as sort of well-suited to telling us about critical life outcomes. So what could we expect in the way down future if we embed in kindergartners sophisticated social competence or self-control? And what we're learning is that from these studies is that things like self-control down at the bottom of that little scale, measured when children are 4 and 5, predicts these kinds of life outcomes 20 to 30 years later, after controlling all those socio-demographic factors that make a difference in there and intervening academic skills and competencies. So there's still, it's not causal because it's a correlational study, but there's still a link between the two that is observed in these data. Between self-control measured early and having a job and keeping a job, enrolling in and sticking with higher education, being physically healthy, not overly using substances, having some personal finances, meaning a bank account, and not being engaged in the criminal justice system. We see that for self-control in another study, social competence measured at kindergarten age. And then my colleague David Deming has written, not that recently, but maybe 4 or 5 years ago, about how the skills of self-control, social competence, in early childhood are the skills that are demanded will be demanded in the future labor market. So we really do see this relatively robust link between these kinds of things and not just academic outcomes, but the things that make people successful in their life. Okay, we also have large multi-program studies, trials of specific interventions in preschool, schools, and after-school context. So this is when someone takes an intervention and implements it in a setting like a classroom or a school and evaluates it and follows people for a long period of time. They randomize people to curricula or classrooms and so on. And from these, there are many of these, we know about the different kinds of social, emotional, behavioral outcomes or academic outcomes that we can expect if we engage in a kind of deliberate change initiative around this area. And it turned out that, on average across studies, these effects are relatively robust. So we could, if we do one of these programs, we could reasonably expect, if we do it exactly the way it was done in the study, remember that, we could expect to see these kinds of effects. So effect sizes, of up to half a standard deviation or even a third of a standard deviation for some of these academic outcomes. These kinds of studies evaluate programs, curricula, typically, that exist in a school, that have a scope and sequence and unfold over a school year, usually or ideally within a allotted time every day to do it. Okay, so this is just a snapshot of the results of a meta-analysis that came out in 2011, and this was the Castle study, people call it. It was a meta-analysis, it was in child development, and they looked at effects on outcomes from very loosely defined social emotional learning programs across early, middle, and adolescence. 213 studies, and they presented these average effect sizes. So, this is robust-ish. I don't think that this gives us useful information about what kind of intervention or program or strategy we might adopt, and then what we might expect from that individual one. But it does give us a general sense of how these programs overall do. And this has been replicated more recently by other brave meta-analyzers and have been published, and there's a bunch of stuff out there. So we feel pretty confident about those average effects. We also know from a number of studies that children who struggle the most and children who face the kind of most adversities, like they come from vulnerable experiences, vulnerable environments, or have faced trauma and adversity, they tend to do better than kids who haven't as a result of these interventions. So this is just an example from one study where it was a study that I did of a program called 4Rs. And in this case, we found that the kids who were identified by their teachers at the beginning of the study as struggling the most with behavior, those kids in the intervention schools, so where we were implementing this social emotional learning intervention, they did better academically than their peers in the control schools. And what this told us, and this is a story that has been replicated across different studies, it told us that there is something about the experience, the general experience of implementing a program like this in a school that makes the learning environment different for kids who struggle with behavior. So we found that they did better in math and reading, but also that they went to school on average 6 more days a year than their counterparts in the control school. So for kids who are typically excluded and left out of the learning environment, these are the kids who get expelled, who will have in-school suspensions, who are not in the classrooms. These kids were in the classrooms and they were doing better academically, which is a story that is not often told about social emotional learning and equity, and is important, which is why I spent so much time on it. Okay, different effects for different kids, and then finally we have all these meta-analyses I talked about, and some are bravely entering into the world of cost-benefit work, and apparently, according to some of the early ones, there is an $11 return on every dollar invested in a program that is under this big umbrella. Last bit of the evidence is about a new science of stress, the brain and behavior, and I talk about this because I think it's actually really important for those who are doing practical work on the ground in classrooms, because it gives us a window into what's going on inside a child when they are engaging in behaviors that none of us like to see. So a child who's acting out, super aggressive, violent, we don't understand why, and this science gives us a signal about it, and I think helps us think about productive, effective strategies for responding. So this new science of stress, the brain and behavior, tells us that social and emotional skills and competencies develop in the context of experience, right? They're highly attuned to experience, and certain of them are particularly vulnerable to experiences of stress and adversity. So I'm going to talk about that for a teeny bit. I'm going to start by talking about stress, and those of you who, I bet you all know all of this, because I bet you all know it, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. So this is work that comes out of the Center on the Developing Child and is widely disseminated and is really about how toxic stress gets under the skin and influences the brain and behavior. And so we start by talking about stress. What are these different forms of stress? And the Center on the Developing Child and a whole host of neuroscientists in the field have described stress as being either tolerable and then moving along a continuum to toxic. So tolerable is everyday stress. It's me standing up here in front of a group I don't know and not really sure about what's going to happen. That makes me stressful. I got all sweaty and I was a little nervous. But everybody was so friendly, smiling, and I calmed down. So that was tolerable stress, and I learned from that experience that the next time I'll probably be okay again. Tolerable stress. For a child, this might be entering a new classroom for the first time with the support of a parent or a kindly teacher awaiting them. Tolerable stress, and you learn from it. Then moving along the continuum, we have things like persistent chronic exposure to exclusion, derision, or negativity. This is small forms of stress that might occur every day. Imagine that young child in the classroom whose name is called all the time by the teacher. Joey, Joey, Joey. And each one of those is like a little hit to that child's body because they're being called out for something they're doing wrong, likely, right? That is a stress experience for that child. Accumulation of distressing experiences over time. So this might be chronic exposure to poverty and all the kinds of things that come along with it. Might be exposure to violence in your neighborhood, exposure to things that happen to you as you go to school. And then significantly traumatic experiences. Imagine a young child who doesn't speak the language, separated from their parent, and not knowing when they're ever going to see them again. Traumatic experience. So the Center on the Developing Child, backed by neuroscience, describes this form of stress as getting under the skin and influencing the brain and behavior. And they describe it as really located in the stress response system, which works like this. I am no brain scientist, so don't hold me to the specifics here, but I'll tell you generally, how does the stress response system work? It works I'll describe it as a dynamic interplay between two parts of the brain. The prefrontal cortex, which is this front part, and the limbic system, which is like in the back. Now you know for sure I'm not a neuroscientist. The prefrontal cortex is the part that is like the executive of the brain. It is the slow thinking part of the brain. It is responsible for careful, deliberative thinking and decision making. It's where all those executive functions lie. It expands dramatically in early childhood, but then again, it has a smaller expansion, but still big, moving into young adulthood. And this is where people make decisions. It's the calm, thoughtful part of the brain. The limbic system is the reactive. Sometimes people call it like the lizard brain. It's the earliest to originate in our history. It is the reactive center. It's the part that drives the fight or flight response. So these two parts of the brain work in interaction with each other in different situations. So if a lion runs into this room right now, what do we want to have happen? We want the back part to take over and be like, run! You don't even want to think run. You just want to run. But if that front part is in charge, you're going to collaborate with your person sitting next to you, you're going to talk about what to do, and you're going to make a plan, and you're maybe going to argue about what the best solution is, and you'll be eaten by the lion. So the system makes sense. It works in certain situations. But for those who are chronically exposed to stress, where this system is activated over and over again, even in response to small things, those small things that happen regularly in a classroom, for example, the back part gets better at taking over. It takes over more often. And you see reactive responding in kids to something that might seem innocuous. A slamming door, a harsh word, a question they don't know the answer to, right? Could result in a freeze response that's like, oh, the stress system has taken over and my front of my brain's gone and I don't know what to say, so I'm freezing. It gives us a signal about what's going on when we see behaviors that we might automatically interpret as something else, right? So if we can design strategies that respond to this dynamic or prevent some of this sort of stress response from taking over in small situations, we might be able to break the connection between stress and behavior. So children and adults who face toxic or chronic levels of stress are at higher risk for neurocognitive and behavioral difficulties with executive function and self-regulation. So the way this works is that the stress response system results in the front of the brain becoming less effective at taking charge in stressful situations. And what we want is for it to take charge, right? We want to be able to, when I walk in front of the room, I don't want to just fall apart because I'm a little stressed because I'm talking to a new group and then forget everything I was going to say, get disorganized and maybe cry a little bit. I don't know, do something that isn't useful. I want this part to take over and say, calm down, you're okay. And then I start. So what we see is this kind of stress behavior cascade. And stress influences this part of the system and it cascades into all of those other things that I talked about. And so, as a kind of preview, much of the intervention, strategy, and practice kind of work that we do in the lab is focused at the bottom of this as a pathway to supporting this more complex skills and competencies at the top. So that's 25 to 30 years of science. That was like 10, 15 minutes or so. So now you know pretty much everything that I know. Okay, on to the practice. So what do? This is a snapshot of a guide we wrote for the Wallace Foundation and is available free online on the Wallace Foundation website. If you just Google navigating SEL from the inside out, it will come up. It's 480 pages, so don't print it. But it's hyperlinked and you can look through it. It's basically a guide to 25 SEL programs designed for elementary school. And it has a lot of cross-program information and then detailed and very specific and obsessive profiles of each of the 25 programs. And we did it because our funders and we felt that there wasn't enough information about the specific kinds of practices that work across programs. Like, what kinds of things are in all the programs, right? So what do we know about what works across all of these big efforts? And we wanted to do this guide so we could learn something about that. The funders wanted us to do the guide because they felt that the field needed more information about specific programs. So we did the guide, and we're actually in the process of doing another one for pre-K and a third one for middle school and high school. So just hang on, and those will be available not very soon. 2 years. First one in 1 year, the second one. So, but going through all of that, so writing this guide and really looking deeply inside the programs that dominate the field, at least for elementary school, we got a sense of really what's effective across them. This is what you see from other kind of synthetic writing in social emotional learning. We see two basic things, two coordinated strategies, characterize what's effective. One is teaching social and emotional skills. most of you are like, well, of course, duh. It's not that obvious to many people that you actually can teach it directly. What is attention? What does that word mean? What does it look like when someone is paying attention or not paying attention? What can you do to get your attention organized? That's teaching, and it often doesn't happen quite in that way. If you look at effective instructional practices, they are really four things. That the skill is modeled, so someone is showing it and living it in how they interact. The skill is taught. I just talked about that. There's an opportunity to practice, to try it, to not be good at it, try again, get some support, and there's a kind of language of SEL in the setting. The second strategy is establishing safe, caring learning environments with effective classroom management. So it's very hard to learn about emotions or acquire effective emotion management if someone is yelling at you about it, right? I mean, that makes sense. So even if the instruction is really, really great in a particular setting, if the surround is not supportive, it's not going to take hold. And so both really have to be done together. So here are some examples. For model, adults and peers can model the language and behaviors across environments, so adults really have to live this kind of work. We were in a school once when we were doing our study of that 4 R's program that I mentioned, and we were collecting data in the school. It was wonderful, and the teacher came out of the classroom and she said, I just love this program. I just love it. I just think it's so wonderful. I just love doing it. She turned around, if I see you ever do that again, you are out of here, to some kid. And everyone's like this. Oh gosh, do you love it? Wait, what are you communicating in this moment? So adults really need support to, have and deliver the skills themselves. And there are lots of strategies, there are lots of ways of doing this in a setting. We might have a scaffold for children that helps them say what they feel in a situation. As it turns out, that kind of scaffold is equally useful for adults. Because when they are using it with children, they are practicing it themselves. So there are scaffolds like that. There are things like Think Aloud, where adults are encouraged to narrate their feelings. I'm feeling really frustrated right now because not everybody is sitting in their seat. What am I going to do? I think I might have to take a couple of deep breaths. And then all of a sudden, all the children they're like this, because someone is sharing an experience with them, something that they struggle with too. Teach. Teach happens often in SEL programs through high-quality children's literature, no surprise there, and then through lessons or skills-based activities. The real sort of magic of SEL, I think, happens through great books. And those great books have stuff in them that kids care about. It's really the stuff that they're grappling with. They're about emotions, they're about separation, they're about friendships, they're about all kinds of things that they are captivated by and are a great platform for learning about this stuff, but also, building vocabulary and all the other things that we really want kids to do. And then, of course, there's, opportunities to learn a strategy or something that happens in a sequence of steps, and that might happen through a lesson. And then practice and discuss is really routines and games, so things that happen every day. Everybody has to line up every single day in an early childhood classroom a lot of times. That's not simply a chance to line up, right? There's nothing about lining up that is instructive unless you use it as a chance to learn something about how to manage yourself when you're lining up. But you have to do it a lot, and it's a routine, and so you can practice something while you're doing it. Makes a lot of sense to me. Prepared role plays, paired learning. These are all opportunities to both practice something over and over again in a setting, but also have a rich discussion about it. So to bring the words up into the environment and really interact about social emotional stuff. And then the part that's probably the hardest when implementing a program is to think outside the program and take advantage of those real world experiences as they arise. So social and emotional learning, social and emotional skills, are not just in the 30-minute lesson, right? Emotions don't just happen there. They happen all the time. They are in every single interaction. They are in every relationship. So there is an opportunity to talk about this stuff in any moment, any context. And so it's really a matter of sort of seeing, this is the bus. I'm sorry. Do you mind if I just, everybody take a break and stand up? It's my son's bus. Hello. Yes, he should not be on the bus. He's cross country. I call my husband. Okay. That's happened several times this fall. My son is not supposed to be on the bus, but no one told the bus that he wasn't going to be on the bus. So the bus is waiting. It all happens.
You can say, I feel frustrated because.
I can go on. Practice. I feel frustrated that you didn't tell the bus driver that you weren't going to be on the bus today. And then I will ask him, how do you feel? I won't practice that part of it. It's just all so I learned the most about all of this, not from any research, but from my own family. I mean, so I'll just digress for another minute, but it's true. Like the experience of being a teacher, managing children in a classroom, being a parent, raises all of this up, and you see where you have major fault lines, right? You see where it breaks down, and you see the consequences. And if you can see them, you have a chance at fixing it. But you have to see them, and they have to happen, which is just life. Which gets me back to the point that I was actually making, which is that, sometimes we say, like, I'm gonna choose our district or our school or our place is gonna choose to do social emotional learning as our new initiative. Wow, that's terrific. I'm so happy to hear that. The truth is that you haven't not been doing it, right? Because it's all these things are always happening. You just haven't been doing it with any kind of plan or intentionality. And you haven't been thinking about how can I leverage the truth of experience in order to really teach effectively. So it's not that it's not there. It's always there. Okay, and then, these are other kinds of routines and games, and I'll talk about those brain games again. So generally, sort of stepping up a little bit, what are the key features of effective practice? They include, according to Castle, having these safe elements to a curriculum. They're sequenced, explicit, focused, and sequenced, active, focused, and explicit. Those are the safe ingredients. And in their meta-analysis, they suggested that programs that have those characteristics are more effective than programs that don't. SEL occurs within supportive contexts. I addressed that already. They build and focus on adult skills and competencies, which are really necessary to the whole enterprise. They partner with families and communities. They are very targeted and specific about the kinds of skills that their strategies are designed to move, and they set reasonable goals. So that's all super helpful. I don't find it actually all that helpful when you think about what am I actually going to do something that is going to make a difference. And so the way I think about that is actually three things. To do SEL well, we need to integrate it into the fabric of schools and schooling, or the fabric of any kind of setting. It has to live in the structure and the practice of the place. So how do we see social and emotional skills within the academic content we are already teaching? How do we see it or How are we impacting it through other kinds of structures that happen in a school? Where do social emotional learning and discipline come together? I don't think that you can have rigid and punitive discipline systems in a school and be a school that is really doing social and emotional learning well. Have to think about how those systems go together. So integration, a clear and explicit focus on adults. So really thinking about how to support adults to grow their own skills and competencies, to not freak out when they get home about the bus, right? Again, that's something that I might do if I didn't have some of those skills, or if I hadn't freaked out about the bus before and learned that it didn't go that well and wasn't all that effective as a strategy. So really giving teachers supports and strategies that help them grow their own self-regulation, to manage their own genuine, real, legitimate responses to stress in the classroom. And then finally, maintaining the quality and sustainability of practices on the ground. So one of the things that I'll turn to now as we go into kind of innovations in practice and innovations in research and in the field is that programs have been evaluated, there are a whole lot of them, and they are terrific as a thing. They're nearly never, almost never, I would say maybe absolutely never, implemented as they were either designed or studied. So this question of how to maintain quality and sustainability is really quite critical if we are to realize the outcomes that we now all expect from SEL in the field, because we've been told so much that it works. And this question is a really tough one. It's a tough one for any kind of educational reform enterprise or any kind of an educational initiative. But I think there are ways to address it, but it is critical. So that's the practice. And now I'm going to move to innovations. You've all had a little break, so everybody's still awake? Yeah, okay. Once my mother called when I was doing something like this, and I did not answer it, but I was a little worried if that was something she doesn't often do. Okay, so the first innovation that I think is a pathway to more effective practice, perhaps research and policy, is SEL kernels. And I'm going to talk about what kernels mean and our set of experiences with them. And I'll start with reminding you of something I've already said, which is, what does SEL typically look like in practice? It is programs, right? These are the kinds of programs that when folks think of SEL, they typically think of one of these programs, at least in the US. Many of these are translated and in places all around the world. And these are not necessarily bad things, but these have been the basis for the work that we have available to us now. And they are multi-component, they have lots of parts to them, they are generally complex, they have often a scope and a sequence, they have lots of units, and the units themselves have lots of parts to them, and they are intended to be implemented in the way they were designed. So, you know, if there's 12 units, you're supposed to do the 12 units and do them in the sequence that they're put together by the developers. They're generally viewed to be effective, meaning when you do this kind of treatment package approach where you randomize the program here, but not to here, and you evaluate it as a whole thing, they're generally viewed as effective. There's very little theory or thinking about what makes them effective, what components account for their effectiveness. There is nearly no research that tackles that question. What we also know is that buy-in is relatively limited, so saying to a district or as a principal saying to a school, we are going to do SEL, and it will be the PATHS program. Most people, most teachers in a setting will say, I don't want to do that. I didn't have anything to do with the decision. I don't know why you're asking me to do this, and I'm not really going to probably do it. I'm not going to tell you that, but I probably won't open this box. And that's really what happens. So buy-in is limited, resources are constrained, there often isn't the time available to do the stuff as it's designed. It's costly, training is limited. We hear all the time about districts that have adopted one program or another but didn't adopt the training. They just bought the boxes and distributed them to the classrooms, or bought one and asked everybody to photograph it, which I understand. I do, because resource, it's costly. These things cost.